What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. There's a very good chance that my brain just might explode in a bloody mess right in the middle of this video because I'm finally getting a chance to do my non-spoiler review of Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune, or I should say his part 1, because this movie is only half of that book. If you've read the novel, you already know the perfect spot where Villeneuve could leave us hanging, and sure enough he did, and I would have gladly sat there for 2.5 more hours with a big giant smile on my face. But first, Denis Villeneuve, he's got to make part 2, so hopefully this first film, a wildly ambitious piece of science fiction, will find the proper audience. I really have no idea how audiences are going to respond. Many people are going to feel like I did, like they've been under this hypnotic spell watching one of the most original science fiction films that they've seen in years. It's big, it's sweeping, it aspires to be both an epic, entertaining story as well as high art. But I'm sure there are going to be plenty of folks out there who are totally bewildered, scratching their heads, completely unaccustomed to seeing any big budget movie that actually makes demands on their intelligence. After my press screening, I heard a lot of people in the theater asking out loud if anybody could explain the movie to them. The sad reality is that even amongst critics is that most movie theaters are full of folks who chew with their mouths open while scrolling through their text the entire movie, and these are the people who need to embrace Dune in large numbers if Warner Brothers is to give the green light to Denis Villeneuve to make his part 2. It's sad, but true. The good news is that the movie is already performing relatively well in a lot of international territories during its slow rollout, but the big test is when Dune finally gets its US release date on October 22nd. Dune fans will all need to whisper a small prayer to Shai Hulud that the movie will manage to connect with moviegoers, but until then, all I can do is encourage people to go see it, and for folks who like to get a little deeper into the weeds on the subject of Dune, I'll be circling back for a deeper breakdown of the movie once the movie's in wide release. Plus, I really want to see the movie again. Whenever I watch an adaptation of a book that I love, initially I really have to wrestle with the movie that I hope to see versus the movie that I actually saw, and a second viewing will absolutely help me appreciate Villeneuve's unique vision without being distracted by details that I wish had been included or done differently. For now, let's just talk big picture. The best comparison I can make for what Denis Villeneuve has done with Frank Herbert's Dune is by reminding people of the challenges faced by Peter Jackson when he was making certain creative decisions on how to handle his adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring, the first movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. While we can discuss until doomsday whether or not we agree with all of Villeneuve's creative decisions, what he chose to include, how he visualized it, and what material sadly had to be left out, in the end, there's no denying that this movie is Villeneuve's own unique interpretation of the material. Because the movie doesn't feel like it was written by a committee. It makes a minimum of commercial concessions, dumbing down the material. For better or for worse, this is a movie directed by an artist bringing to life a novel that I think is one of the greatest feats of the human imagination of the 20th century. And keep in mind that the book has the luxury of feeding the audience so much information across hundreds of pages, a luxury that Villeneuve simply doesn't have. In a lot of ways, it's an impossible task. Inevitably, certain plot details get streamlined, and certain key characters have been outright removed, but I'm assuming they're going to make an appearance in the eventual part 2. My biggest criticism of the movie is the absence of one key villain, but more on that later. But having now been immersed in his vision for 2.5 hours, I can assure all of you that Denis Villeneuve has used every technical and dramatic trick in his toolkit to try and deliver a movie that just feels special. As it turns out, this movie is that rare thing that I hoped it would be, the kind of grand spectacle that Hollywood used to make. A movie that aspires to be a hit and a classic all at once. Think Lawrence of Arabia, think Apocalypse Now. This is a grand piece of entertainment created with the best artistry that the director is capable of. And I'll gladly watch the movie a few more times before I make my final decision on how it compares to those epics of the past, but very clearly Denis Villeneuve is aspiring to greatness with this project. But the big question though for the rest of this video is, what can I discuss without giving anything away? As I was riding home on a bicycle, I waged this internal debate over what details about the story should be considered spoilers. Because Frank Herbert's novel, which I have right here over my shoulder, it's been thrilling millions of readers for decades at this point, so a lot of people out there obviously know the story. We also had David Lynch's movie adaptation in 1984, which I caught in the theater as a kid, which was my first introduction to this world. And we also had the popular miniseries Dune in 2000. And then of course there's one of my all-time favorite documentaries, Jodorowsky's Dune, a brilliant look inside Alejandro Jodorowsky's attempt at making the film back in the 1970s, and that movie might be the best love song to the creative process that I've ever seen. My point is that a lot of people out there already know this story, and I'd like to believe that most science fiction fans have a pretty firm grasp of the basics of the story, even if they've not yet done the deep dive. And if you haven't done the deep dive, I strongly urge you to check out all the above, especially Frank Herbert's novel, which I find to be endlessly rewarding each time I reread it. But in very broad strokes, here is the backdrop of the story for people who know nothing about Dune. Dune is the tale of two warring houses in the far future, the Atreides and the Harkonnens. I've been pronouncing them the Harkonnens for decades, but the movie refers to them as Harkonnens. In any event, these two bloodlines have been at war for centuries, and their feud only intensifies when their emperor decides that the Atreides should take over spice production on the desert planet Arrakis, a role previously held by the Harkonnens. The spice melange is the most valuable resource in the universe, with the navigation of space being one of its many uses. So naturally, any family serving this role for the emperor faces enormous political pressure, in addition to the incredible challenge of harvesting the spice on a world where the sun kills you, the sandstorms kill you, and of course the big giant sandworms will absolutely fucking kill you. And the Harkonnens, they chose to abuse the people of Arrakis, squeezing the planet like power-mad despots, while the Atreides family, they hope to form an alliance with the people of Arrakis, the Fremen, living in harmony alongside them while still serving the needs of the Empire. And at the center of this giant political conflict is the young Paul Atreides, played brilliantly by Timothée Chalamet, who is rapidly becoming one of my favorite actors of his generation. My first instinct is always to despise any kid who's that good looking, but I've seen enough of his movies now to know that he has some serious chops as an actor. In any event, the story of Dune is what happens to Paul when he goes to Arrakis. Paul's the son of Duke Leto Atreides, brought to life by the legendary Oscar Isaac, as well as the Lady Jessica, played by the lovely Rebecca Ferguson, who really shines in her role. The Lady Jessica is a member of the Bene Gesserit, the secretive organization armed with quasi-mystical abilities as well as vast political influence. And their organization manipulates the bloodlines of the major houses, hoping one day to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, a man who can wield their terrifying power. And one of my favorite ingredients of the story is that Leto and Jessica have chosen to surround Paul with advisors, trainers, and companions who can arm him with the mental disciplines and physical skills that he'll need to survive in the war against the Harkonnens. We've got the great salty veteran Gurney Halleck, played to perfection by Josh Brolin, even if I still privately prefer Patrick Stewart in the role. There's the Mentat Thufir Hawat, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, and a Mentat's basically a human computer in a universe that has shunned the use of actual computers ever since the Butlerian Jihad, a war that I won't be getting into here, but it's tons of fun to discuss. And last but not least, we have the swordsman Duncan Idaho, played with tons of zest and enthusiasm by Jason Momoa, Aquaman himself, who in many ways is like a big brother to Paul. I wasn't necessarily the world's biggest fan of some of the new dialogue cooked up for his character, in that it completely clashes with the tone of Herbert's original text, but Jason Momoa, he's so damn likable in the role, I will gladly give the movie a pass on this front. Because across the board, the cast is just first rate. It's one of the best casts that we've ever seen in a giant movie like this. My only lingering questions are with those characters who we really haven't seen in action that much yet, namely the Fremen, who just like in the book, don't really take center stage until later in the story, apart from the characters Liet Kynes and the Shadout Mapes. And even though Javier Bardem is one of my favorite actors on planet Earth at this time, I'm going to need to see more of him as Stilgar before I render my final verdict, because that is a character with very big shoes to fill, but I have every confidence in the world in Javier Bardem, but once again, we just need to see more of him. And Zendaya, she's got tons of screen time as Chani, but mostly in the form of these mysterious visions and dreams that Paul's having. And speaking of which, one of those dreams is so earth-shattering and cool that I'm going to give myself a heart attack by not discussing it, but it is the spoiler of all spoilers. I can't get to it now, but let's just say that Paul has the power to foresee possible outcomes, and one of them happens to be my favorite scene of the movie. But getting back to Zendaya, I like her in the role, but her juiciest dramatic scenes will be coming up in part 2. Also, all sci-fi nerdery aside, just seeing Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya on the screen together, every single teenager on the planet is just going to squeal with delight. But the characters that we see plenty of in this movie are Paul's enemies, the Harkonnens, as they launch their attack on the Atreides, trying to rip control of Arrakis back from them. I can't really go into the nuances of this political struggle without spoilers, but the Harkonnens are the bad guys. Of course they're going to fight our heroes, and the Harkonnens are some of the most sinister villains imaginable. I love the way their homeworld of Gidi Prime was depicted, the architecture, the uniforms, everything, just the tone was perfect. And Dave Bautista, he's pretty cool as the Beast Raban, and the way Polka Dot Man himself is the Mentat Piter de Vries, but the biggest show stealer of the whole movie is, of course, Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a character who I regard as arguably the best villain written in the history of the science fiction genre. How about that? Big claim on my part, but that's how I feel. He is just fucking diabolically evil, completely at peace with being an utter monster. And Stellan Skarsgård, he leans all the way in on bringing this legendary character to life. physically revolting in every way. His grotesque appearance is only exceeded by his cunning and his intelligence, making him potentially the most dangerous person in the universe. The only thing missing is the person that he's grooming as his heir, and from my point of view, the story of Paul Atreides is incomplete without being able to compare and contrast his journey with his evil counterpart in his rival house. Batman has the Joker, Sherlock Holmes has Professor Moriarty, and Paul Atreides has Fade Routha. And I am just slack-jawed with disbelief that his character was not included in this movie, which we've all known for well over 2 years is not a spoiler, but this is my one major criticism of the movie. And yet, be that as it may, my criticism might totally vanish and evaporate into thin air if Villeneuve manages to give Fade Routha some killer scenes in part 2 or a killer introduction. He might be saving that character to inject some new blood into the follow-up movie, so to be continued. For now, all we can do is just enjoy Sting and his Silver Mankini in the David Lynch film. And the last character I want to praise is Charlotte Rampling as the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, a character just as terrifying and ruthless as Baron Harkonnen, but she has her own agenda, one that completely transcends the bitter feud between the Harkonnens and the Atreides. And Sean Phillips, she's a very tough act to follow, but Charlotte Rampling gives it her all. And once again, if I haven't said so enough, this cast is the stuff that dreams are made of. At any rate, I'm leaving out a few other characters related to some very plot-specific spoilers, but I'll get to them in my next video. So let's leave the cast behind for now and talk about the crew. First and foremost, the DP, Greg Fraser. He has shot a stunning movie, but it's more raw and rugged as opposed to beautiful. Denis Villeneuve's last movie, Blade Runner 2049, was beautiful, but Dune, it's harsh. It's a visual approach that reflects the challenges that Paul must endure on his journey. And there are going to be a lot of people who prefer David Lynch's much more stylized depiction of Arrakis, and that's totally valid, but Denis Villeneuve's clearly trying to strip away the romanticism of the visual language of the movie. Hans Zimmer's music, it's solid, not necessarily a home run, but close enough. My only real technical criticism is with the adaptation of the book, admittedly a Herculean task. One of the biggest challenges in adapting the book is how to handle all the interior thoughts and monologues of the characters, because in the book, these thoughts are almost like a second set of dialogue running parallel to the character's spoken words. And David Lynch, he chose to just include some of these thoughts, but in a movie, these thoughts can come across as pretty clunky. So this particular screenplay leaves them out entirely, but as a result, a lot of the scenes in the movie, they feel incomplete without a visual component to fill in the missing information. And as I mentioned before, I wasn't a fan at all of the more conversational dialogue that's been thrown into the movie. I know it makes the movie more accessible to some people, but a lot of this dialogue sounds like it was cooked up by the fellas at a nearby gymnasium, and it doesn't fit in at all with the rest of the dialogue that is very true to the spirit of Frank Herbert's original text. And my last critique is with some of the action. While some of the action scenes are just gorgeous to behold, especially an early scene where Gurney Halleck is training Paul Atreides, a scene that teaches the audience a key mechanic in how war is waged in this fictional setting. Many people might wonder why no one uses a friggin' blaster in the story. Well, that's because people use shields for protection, and in the book, shooting a laser at a shield causes an explosion that can kill both parties in the exchange. So now everybody uses knives and swords like it's medieval times again, and only a slow blade can penetrate the shield that's being used in combat, leading to this really cool and unusual fighting style, mixing attacks and feints at different speeds. But there are times in this movie where it appears as if it all just became too much effort to keep this style going. And when you're talking about desert combat, it doesn't really matter because no one can use a shield because it'll attract a worm. But there's still tons of fight scenes with shields where, irrespective of the speed of the blow, they seem to be killing people all the same. A detail that I think is going to seem increasingly contradictory to the rules of the movie on second and third viewings. That said, I did enjoy the combat overall, especially when we see the small subtle differences between the fighting styles of the Atreides, the Harkonnens, the Fremen, and the Sardaukar. But more on the Sardaukar in my spoiler review. Now, I'm rapidly running out of non-spoiler things to discuss, but I guess I can close with the depiction of life on Arrakis. The still suits are functional, but not necessarily the slickest in appearance. A lot of the uniforms in this movie can get a little tough to tell apart when people are rolling around in sand, stabbing each other. But the movie does do a good job of exploring just how quickly the sun, the wind, and the worms can kill you, especially if you don't possess any of the skills of the Fremen who live deep, deep, deep in the desert. But in spite of all that danger, the movie manages to make the Fremen way of life seem so beautiful in so many ways, even if it is a life full of struggle and death. I guess this is all a long-winded way of saying that I liked the movie. I really enjoyed the movie. Perhaps I even loved the movie, but I kind of had to write down all my thoughts just to get an idea of what I really felt about it. So is it the Dune that I would wish to see if I could just pluck a perfect movie right out of my head as I'm reading the book? No. But it is an incredibly worthy adaptation and a welcome addition to the family of film and television adaptations of this colossal story that we've seen so far. Speaking of the story, personally, I've only read the first 4 books. For some reason, I keep rereading the first book instead of going any further, but one of these days I'm going to crack open book 5. But for now, I'm going to wrap up this video. I look forward to discussing this flick with everyone over the next few months. And once again, all of us Dune freaks need to band together like Paul and Jessica joining Stilgar in order to make sure that Warner Brothers hears us loud and clear that we want to see part 2. But I hope you enjoyed listening to my point of view. If so, remember to like and subscribe. But I hope everyone loves the movie. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.